Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Logtech Live, the August 2nd, 2024 episode of our show. This is the place to be, first and third Fridays of every month, 10 a.m. Eastern. So glad that you could join us. If this is your first time catching an episode, you picked a really good one. We have a super awesome guest with a really interesting topic, very timely topic. If you're a longtime viewer, thank you so much for supporting the show. I'm glad you're getting some value out of it. I'm in Delhi, India still. This is the last episode that I'll be broadcasting from India. I'll be back in the US in mid-August for the next episode, but really glad to be here. You can't see, I think, on screen, but I've eaten a lot while I'm here, so the food is just too good to pass up. So a few things before I get to news of the week and bring my guest on this week. Inland 24. We are less than 2 months away. We are super excited. The Journal of Commerce team, super excited about the event this year. We really spent a lot of time thinking about the program and building it a little more holistically and making sure there was value for different sets of audiences. Shippers, obviously, freight brokers, carriers, software vendors, basically any entity that has a stake, obviously intermodal providers, the railroads, even ports, drayage providers, anybody who has a stake in the surface transportation market, you're going to find value at this event. If you've been to the Inland before, you know the program is awesome. This year, it's even bigger and better. We have one-on-ones with a whole bunch of interesting people that are very, very timely. For instance, Adam Miller of Knight Swift. They've made a couple interesting acquisitions of late. Phil Yeager of Hub Group, we're doing a one-on-one with. I'm doing a couple really interesting one-on-ones with Ken Adamo of DAT Freight and Analytics. I'm talking with a colleague about the Mexico market, about sort of the business climate there, not just the freight side of things, but the actual economic and business climate. I'm talking to Robbie Nathan, a longtime industry freight brokerage veteran, about why not Uber Freight, but Uber for Freight didn't quite click for a lot of the industry. So that's just tip of the iceberg. There's so many sessions. Definitely go onto the site and catch the whole agenda. We also have a whole bunch of academy sessions. We have some really interesting seminars that we have some outside contributors helping with, that are targeted at LTL shippers and also small carriers. So if you're in any of those groups, click on the registration link, click to register, and I'll see you in Chicago in a little over 8 weeks. IPH, the following week, right after I'll be in Chicago, I will be in Hamburg, Germany at the International Association of Ports and Harbors World Ports Conference, where I'll be leading a bunch of panels around digitization and technology for global ports. Super, super cool event. If you've never been, highly encourage you to go. If you're in the world of ports, if you're dependent on ports, which basically everyone in international freight is, definitely encourage you to come and be part of the discussion. It's a very open, kind of welcoming environment there. And it's really about ports sharing best practices with one another. So I will be there and hope to see you there. One last thing I'll mention before news of the week, Blended Pledge. I talk about it almost every episode. This is Sarah's initiative, Sarah Barnes-Humphrey of Let's Talk Supply Chain, her initiative to drive, to raise money for people who don't have the budget to travel, especially those who are underrepresented voices on stages at industry events. Oftentimes, I see this all the time. I invite someone to speak. They turn it down for one reason or another. Sometimes it's they don't have the budget to travel. So we don't want that to happen. We want what's happening on stage to represent what the industry looks like off stage. So this is an awesome, awesome cause. Donate as much as you can. $1, $2, $1 million, whatever. Somewhere in between there is probably makes sense for most people. All right. News of the week. Some interesting research that I wrote about from McKinsey last week, showing that in 2023, the amount of money invested into, I believe it was logistics and supply chain startups globally fell 90% from the pandemic high. So that's a 2-year from 21 to 23. I don't think anyone who's been watching this space or covering it like me feels like that's off kilter at all. There was a huge pullback last year. It's recovered a little bit this year, but it was really interesting to get some numbers and data to sort of support what we had been all been feeling, which is that there was a little bit of a loss of appetite from the investor side to invest in logistics. Part of that, the researchers attributed it a little bit or mostly to the demand environment, lower demand, lower rates, just less kind of money sloshing around to invest and trying things. I actually think there's a totally different issue at play that's a lot longer term than just the freight demand market in 23. And that is, this industry takes a long time to make decisions on software, especially consequential software. And those long sales cycles often don't dovetail nicely with the way VCs want to see growth, right? So yes, the demand in the market put pressure on companies to make sales, especially at the pace they were making in 21 and 22. But longer term, this sort of sectoral trend is that it's really hard to get people to speed up their decision making on the buying side. So that's something VC's just going to have to contend with, is if they find models and they still find the logistics industry interesting, which I think they do, right? I think they've come to terms with a few things: how fragmented it is, how the TAM might be relatively small for a single company that's targeting a niche solution in a part of the industry, right? So definitely encourage you to read that. Now, next story cuts totally against that. I think I wrote that story on a Friday, and then the following Monday, Altana. We've had Amy Morrigan from Altana on just a few weeks ago. They raised $200 million. They are now a unicorn, $1 billion valuation. I always love, what if they took a $999,000 or $1 million, valuation and said, no, we're not a unicorn yet, which is one more dollar and then we'll be a unicorn. Obviously it's a nominal thing, but very interesting company. Obviously we've talked about them a little bit on this show. I've written about them a lot. They're sort of tackling this, building a map of the world supplier network, and then what can you do on top of that? And I think that's going to be their next challenge going forward, is having that map and that database. Super interesting, but what can you do on top of it, workflow wise, product wise? That's what they're going to be tackling. That was what they alluded to and what I wrote about in this story. And yes, they are the outlier from that previous story in the McKinsey's research. Okay, and then last story I'll highlight is, this is also a topic that I've written about a ton, electronic bills of lading, and we've talked about it on this show a lot. So PIL, Singapore-based carrier, I forget which, I think they're either top 10 or just outside of the top 10, announced they're going with WaveBL, one of kind of 4 to 5 major vendors of electronic bill of lading technology. This is just another kind of brick in the wall when it comes to this commitment that most of the largest ocean carriers in the world have made to transition completely to electronic bills of lading by 2030. So now we have, I think, 6 or 7 different carriers using one of these vendors. It might be even higher than that at this point. I've lost track a little bit, but now the question comes, they provide this, now it's all about adoption. And can they actually get forwarders and shippers? Can forwarders convince shippers? Can shippers get on board with a process change that will ultimately benefit them, but they might not see the immediate value of it? So very interesting, but the clock's ticking and we're not as far away from 2030 as we think we are. So very interesting. There's been a lot of activity over the last year. So we'll be talking about that issue for sure at TPM 25 in March, which I forgot to mention, Nicole. Our registration for TPM 25 launched yesterday. 25th anniversary of the world's biggest containerized supply chain event, Long Beach, March 2nd through 5th. Next episode, I'll get you all the details on that. First register for inland, and then we'll get you registered for TPM. Okay. with no further ado, I'm super excited to bring my guest on. Deema Adada is founder of a company called BiggerPicture, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Deema, so glad you could join today. Deema was introduced to me by a mutual friend of ours, Samantha Jones, who's been a guest on the show as well a while back. And she said, okay, you need to talk to Deema. Whatever else you do, you need to talk to Deema. And we had a fantastic conversation a few months ago, me kind of understanding what she's building. But before we get into that, Deema, just introduce yourself. Tell us what your career looked like prior to founding BiggerPicture, and then we'll get into exactly what BiggerPicture is.
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank you for having me on this show. I always love your updates and what's happening, even right now with your information on investors in the market from a VC perspective. My background is helping scale freight brokerages, tech forward freight brokerages, being Coyote and Uber Freight from inception. I've always been passionate about technology. I've always sat really close with the product team as we've gone and built out our solutions in-house. And it really, BiggerPicture stems from that experience and understanding, what it took for us to scale, what went into it, but also the impact we have on the larger supply chain network.
Cool. So you just, you were at, give me a time frame. You joined Convoy in what year, and then moved to Uber Freight, just to give people like a sense of.
Sure. I joined Coyote in 2007.
Did I say Convoy, by the way?
You did, but it's okay.
Jeez, Coyote. Sorry. So sorry. Freudian slip.
No worries. And then
Coyote, yes.
I was with Coyote through the UPS acquisition. Okay. And from there, I had moved to San Francisco while still working with Coyote, and Uber Freight was not even Uber Freight yet. Was more on the self-driving transportation side, where I joined the Uber Freight team basically as Uber got stood up on the freight side.
Got it. Mm-hmm. Back when the phrase, as I mentioned earlier, was Uber for freight, and then Uber Freight actually arrived, and people had to go, oh, exactly. I guess we can't call it Uber for freight anymore.
We actually came, yep. So it was also a very interesting time and a fun experience at Uber as well.
Yeah, so we'll get into that. But most importantly, let's give people a picture, no pun intended, of what is BiggerPicture. I'm guessing most people don't yet know about it. What's the product? Who are your customers? Kind of how did it get started? What was the idea behind it?
So BiggerPicture is an AI-powered scheduling and execution platform. And we serve shippers, carriers, and facilities to better plan and execute appointments. The idea behind it was actually during my time at Uber, where I was having to determine how many headcount do we need for scheduling, sitting and timing our reps, seeing what went into it, how painful it was and fragmented, but also thinking about what we were building from a technology standpoint. Like the concept of being able to see where a truck is, what's the ETA, and take action on it really made me think about the airline industry. One, you can go online, you can book your flight, you can pick which timing you're going to go. But as soon as something is happening, in most cases, you start to receive like the text notification, flight's delayed 30 minutes, or gate change, or there's real-time information that's being fed. It's not always the best experience, but it's way better than the experience we have today in freight, where it's like a black box. You may never get a notification or an update, or if you do, you don't have enough information to take action on it. So that really stemmed from that. The inspiration of BiggerPicture is thinking about, we all share a supply chain network. It's shared capacity. Facilities have different customers coming in and out. Shippers have different companies that they're working with. So with a shared network, how do we really get more thoughtful about the coordination and execution when it comes to moving freight?
That's very interesting. I remember I used to write a Substack every week that one of these days I should start up again. And I wrote about kind of that same idea, like this is transportation, freight transportation is like a public pool, right? Like, and if someone does something in the public pool, it affects everybody, right? It's not to get too close, but like we all have to work together to like make the best use of that public pool, right? Like so very interesting to hear you sort of think about it in the same kind of way. So let's, from a scheduling perspective, what have been kind of the like big negative effects from the way that scheduling, and we're talking about truckload scheduling, just to be clear,
Truckload scheduling, yeah.
For everyone, because obviously there's people who are in different parts of the supply chain, but talking specifically about truckload scheduling, what have been the big negative kind of knock-on effects from it, the way it's been historically handled, which I can assume is not incredibly efficient?
It is not incredibly efficient. It's extremely fragmented. So the process typically is a shipper or customer is going to tender a carrier a shipment, and then that carrier is then responsible for coordinating the appointments at each leg of the shipment.
Yep.
That coordination takes place across a multitude of portals, emails, workflows, and they are basically kind of aggregating as much information they can across that transaction to make a decision and schedule those appointments. Yep. In different portals or email, et cetera. So their experience is very manual, very costly for whoever is responsible for scheduling. But then the experience for those who are either at the shipper or at the desk consignee are seeing it as like a single transaction. I have an appointment for a truck to arrive, but I have no understanding of where they're coming from, what the expectation is, how that might impact my business if they're going to run late or cancel, et cetera. So it's not just a pain point, if you will, for the carrier who's scheduling it. It's a pain point for all the stakeholders involved when there's issues that occur and there's very lack of like transparency or visibility to handle any type of change associated with that initial appointment. So it's kind of like, let's schedule it and hope for the best, because we can't really do much if there's a delay or disruption.
So in that second part of your answer, where you're talking about like the receiver or the shipper and how they sort of think of an appointment in a very transactional, singular way, what's the process when something that they don't have context for whether that appointment is actually going to be met or not until it's not met? What has the process generally been to account for that from their perspective?
So it becomes a very reactive situation. Even if they get a call or notification, my driver is going to be running late, they're not optimizing that experience at that location. They're not saying, all right, well, you're going to be late and I know this truck's here and I'm going to take that truck and I'm going to make these changes. It becomes like a ripple effect even within that warehouse and their decision-making process. So it's, again, back to the airport, like the idea of when everything's coming in and now I'm going to take this flight in, you've got real-time tracking, another flight's coming in, you're going to take it to that gate instead, right?
Right.
They don't have that. So oftentimes they're like, just show up when you show up, we'll work you in. And they're just keep rolling through that process. If you look at like an Amazon or a Walmart, they don't care what is happening if you're late. They book their dock doors, they're packed. The line is so long, they're just taking trucks. So for them, it's just like, we've got so much volume. We don't have a minute to even scratch our heads. We're just going to keep going. And if you're late and you get worked in or you have to wait 4 hours because we're running behind, we don't care because our warehouse is still operating at peak capacity.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about other locations, when they don't have that, or they're depending on like grocery, they take orders in first thing in the morning, they're repacking and shipping that out to the store. So if that shipment doesn't make it, that product's not making it out to the grocery store, which is lost sales. Like the effects have ramifications in different ways, depending on where you sit within that supply chain.
Very interesting. Okay. And then if I'm understanding what you said from the carrier perspective or the driver perspective, there's just like, it's like the opposite of a single sort of centralized way to make appointments that feed into all of these receiver systems currently. So you're just sort of like scattershot type approach, call, text, some app, some brokers might have an app, some shippers might have an app that you could, am I right on that?
There's very few that like have an app, but it's mostly like it's the portal, like you're logging into shipper TMS platforms or
the appointment scheduling function on their TMS basically.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Um, okay. So you have described the like what's been wrong with the process. As a reporting on this over the last couple of years, not even couple of years, I would say over the last year and a half, maybe, it seems like there has been a lot of activity since I want to say the start of 23 in addressing this, being led by tech forward brokers, TMSs, some new companies, including yourself, kind of like trying to reorient the way the industry thinks about this. What do you think is behind this amount of activity right now? Like, why is it happening right now?
So the standard scheduling or scheduling standard consortium got started in 2023, and it was by leading digital or tech forward brokers where, I think personally the inception is really thinking about, let's digitize this. We don't need to be so people heavy.
Mm-hmm. We're not
And
competing on this aspect, right? Like,
yeah, we want to digitize it, right? So we got from those providers real-time pricing, online bookings, API marketplaces or connections. And so the next big piece that was extremely manual for those providers that stood this up was scheduling. They really saw the cost implication and the lack of connectivity, making it hard for them to reach that level of automation. So the consortium is made up of tech leaders in freight brokerage or asset, as well as TMS providers on the shipper side, really seeing an opportunity where it definitely benefits the carrier to have more connectivity and automation, but that their providers, these tech providers, TMS providers, E2 Open, for instance, who we're partnered with, where there's benefit for those shippers. So it took enough of a carrier network to push those providers to say there is an issue, like there is an opportunity for us to improve this and bring value to the shippers, and then joined that process. So I think the buzz there has been great. We started prior to 2023 working on this problem, starting with email automation and that process, because we still have like 50% of locations scheduling over email, which is crazy. But I think that enabled, providers to start looking at automation when it comes to scheduling and being able to do things more in real time.
Yeah. So I don't want to like belabor this point, but like, what do you think the inflection point was? So, I mean, you sort of mentioned like there were these other things that the sort of like progressive companies that were sort of pushing the industry forward were addressing first, and then they got to schedules, right? Like, what do you think the inflection point? Like, what was it that's made you start your company at the moment you did, as opposed to 2 years prior or 2 years later?
I think it's probably my experience at Uber, but the digitization and the idea of like, this tech is here, we've got the visibility, like, why are we not doing anything with it? Shippers are receiving ETA tracking, but then they're like, I can't do anything with it because I'm not the one who was responsible for scheduling or have that connection point. Like we came to a standstill there. So that's kind of where I saw the opportunity. I think part of the like evolution and thinking about APIs is what happened with real-time pricing, right? I was with Uber when we started like doing that experience in real time with people and like building these sheets and sending pricing back within a few minutes to moving to the API process. Every API was different. Every company I talked to who's implementing integrations for real-time pricing has this insane backlog because it was all done differently. So these guys who, led some of the real-time pricing initiatives wanted to standardize it. We've never seen brokers come together like a consortium for scheduling ever, right? So like it's clearly
for anything at all, actually,
right? You don't see it. So the fact that they actually agreed to come together, I think that woke people up a bit to say, wow, this is clearly a problem if you are agreeing to sit down together and solve this problem. So I think that has a big portion in drawing more attention to the scheduling issues.
So is it fair to say then that historically the challenge in tackling this problem has not necessarily been a technical one, but like a competitive or cultural one?
I think change in our industry is really hard. And you're not going to be one person to change a shipper who's using a third-party solution to provide that. You
Yep.
need a large group to make a move and get buy-in for those changes to happen at scale. And we're very fragmented on the technology side. Even if you're working with a large TMS, it's very customized to those particular instances. So it's not an easy lift, and it wasn't going to be a one-to-one to drive that change.
Yep.
So I think that's really like,
well, yeah, I mean, even TMS, right? Like you almost have to be more specific, right? Like you specifically said, shipper TMSs were aligned with the schedule consortium. You have broker TMSs, you have carrier TMSs, right? Like,
yep.
Are they all, and it's fragmented within each of those sort of like segments too. So
it's very fragmented. Even with APIs coming out, it's not straightforward. I mean, it's not going to solve. There are, other ways to do that and make those connections. But now that there's an appetite for it, you're seeing definitely more activity in the space.
Yeah. So can you explain a little bit? I mean, you said you were excited and you think there's sort of like, maybe I'm inferring this, but you think there's like a little bit of a wave to ride based on what's been done on the consortium. How does what you do fit into what the consortium is doing?
So we adhere to the API standards, and we integrate and connect with providers that are part of that consortium and outside of that consortium. So from a carrier or broker perspective, we're aggregating that connectivity and supplying, a centralized scheduling process. But we've also seen that carriers, even though they've pushed for this, their systems aren't actually capable of consuming these APIs or managing real-time scheduling. So
and there's no carriers who are
not ready.
part of the consortium, right?
Yeah.
There's no carriers that are part of the consortium.
The brokers, and I think there are some, like JB Hunt has led it, so they're asset brokerage.
Oh, so there's some that have assets.
Yeah, and like Warner's in it. Right. I think you're going to see that blend, and it's like the top 1% of asset and broker market who are part of that consortium, but they also aren't prepared from a technology standpoint still. So we actually handle that. We've got different ways to utilize our system where they can actually use it within their TMS and gain accessibility without having to do that huge technical lift on their end.
Yep. It's very interesting. I mean, obviously over the course of 20 years covering both domestic and international, we've seen a range of standard like pushes happen. And at some point there's just like the standards adoption stalls, and then it's up to technology providers to like smooth the cracks, right? And make it almost invisible. So I think every software company wants standards to be adopted so they can just build the product on top of that. But a lot of your work and the benefit to your customer, I would imagine, is like making where standards can't be adopted, like make that a little bit less painful, right? So,
and it's even with the standard, it's not the same every time.
Sure.
There's just some like standard push pull. But I think that's why there's technology partners like ourselves in the market, because shipper or carriers, what we've even seen is they've invested in RPAs or automation and email, and they're no longer able to keep up with it. So it's becoming outdated or not used. And now they're looking for somebody to partner with rather than build in-house. So we're seeing a lot of that. And I think that's partly with the like pricing API concerns of how much work it's been for them to have to do it one by one, rather than just one partner who's doing it on their behalf.
Sort of like a middleware kind of.
Yeah.
Okay. You talked when you were describing what BiggerPicture is, you use use AI to describe what you're doing. Obviously AI is like everywhere right now, personal, private, professional, but you can't escape the impact of, or you can't escape the topic of what AI is going to mean to our lives going forward. Right. So how do you think the industry, like, let's face it, like there's drivers and you have extremely tech proficient drivers all the way down to people who are not proficient, just like every other walk of life, right? Same at facilities, same at shippers, right? Like even people who sit behind desks and are on their computer all day long might not necessarily have any proficiency when it comes to AI.
Yep.
How do you think people should go about like educating themselves about what matters about AI versus what they may be hearing?
Yeah, I feel like this is always a contentious conversation in our space and like AI, and it's all about automation. Then you lose the human touch. And I don't think in our space, AI should be all about automation. I think it's actually best used in combination with that human element. Freight, like to me, every shipment is different. Even if it's the same lane, it may ship on a different day, maybe end of month, it may be end of quarter, it may be close to a holiday, whatever it may be. There's just different things about each one of those shipments. So there are more exceptions than there are norms or
Yep.
standards, especially in freight brokerage, right? Because freight brokerage is more transactional than you are if you're a dedicated fleet who ships the same lane every day.
Right.
So to me, I think AI and the application of it is actually there to assist in helping people make better, faster, more educated decisions in real time, where freight, like every minute matters. So it's more to help them have the information necessary when the time comes to make a real time decision, whether it's planning, execution, et cetera, and looking at it more as a tool rather than a replacement of that person.
Yeah. That's an interesting way to think of it. I've sort of wrestled with this over the last couple of years about like what the impact is, and I think I think personally we all have a lot of our day. If we examine like what our average day looks like, we have all of these little inefficient parts of it
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason. Like maybe you're just having a bad day and your brain's not thinking correctly, or maybe you're stuck with a bad system that is really hard to get to work through. Maybe the internet's just bad in your office one day, right? Like there's all these inefficiencies that we grapple with. And like I sort of think like, what if AI sort of takes away a certain percentage of that inefficiency? It just makes us better, and we can do the same amount of work in less time, or we can do more work in the same time. I know that may be like kind of a tech utopic view of it, but I actually think you're, especially in freight, like we're just not anywhere close to like an autonomous supply chain, right? So
No, I don't
it
think so. I think there's
yeah,
too
I
many
hope,
variables.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there's too many variables. And I think, there are tasks that can be automated that like are mundane. It's not a value add. And if it can just get done
Yeah.
with basic rules, great, right? But you can see that a rep can be consumed their entire day dealing with an exception or a problem. And then everything else that they were supposed to get done that day doesn't get done, which then also creates, downward effect on
Yep.
the org or their job.
Yep.
So I think it's about where are we allocating our time? How are we, you know, getting better at what we do? How are we solving for certain things? I have less time to work on something, I'm probably putting less quality into it versus if I could really focus on a particular task and not be consumed by, mundane things on the side, maybe I'm producing more. Maybe I'm driving more value to
Yeah.
that certain task. So I think there's just like that combination of how spread thin are you? Where are you
Yep.
allocating time? And can you get
Yep.
better at what you're supposed to be doing?
Do you think about like how something like what you're building, do you think about how, or I should say, I would imagine you do it. How do you think about like the way what you're building impacts that process for a driver in a given like key moment of their day versus someone who's behind a desk versus someone who's on like a facility floor, right? Like how do you think about like how AI affects those people differently? Because I imagine like I can visualize what someone who's behind a computer, how it might impact them. I have a harder time figuring out like someone who's literally driving a truck or like working a forklift or something, like how it impacts them.
I think for a driver, if their experience is smoother going in and out of a location, they're happier,
Yeah.
right? If
Yeah.
they don't have to sit there and nobody's communicating with them, why it's taking so long or what's happening, and it's frustrating. Um, and then they miss their next appointment, and then they're not making it home for the weekend. And it's really hard to be a driver and have these inefficiencies. Like, it's a frustrating job if it's not done well. And it's
Yep.
common to have these issues, right? And for them, it's like every loaded mile is where they're making money. Like, driving empty or having to lay over, or those inefficiencies affects them as well at the end of the day.
Yep.
Forklift drivers. I mean, you talk to warehouses and they're like, it's like drinking out of a fire hose every day. If there's always a fire, I don't know which way is up, right, left. Like, it's constantly changing and it's overwhelming.
Yep.
And that's because, like, you can plan for what's happening within your four walls, but when you don't know what's happening that's like coming in or out, that's going to be affecting your daily schedule, you can't predict it. Every day is different.
Yep.
And also can be tough for those guys, right? It's exhausting. Working in brokerage, every day is different. There's never a dull day. There's always an issue. You're always on your toes and you don't know what to expect. So I think to create some level of like more consistency or reliability helps everyone involved.
That's super interesting. Like, to think about how, like, adoption of something that's, sort of enabled by AI, that's you're not even necessarily using, but someone else is using it, and that's affecting the quality of your day, is I think of kind of like a very constructive way of thinking about that. So that's good. That's very, very good. Good kind of like brain food there. Okay. So I want to double back to the experience at Coyote and not Convoy, Coyote and Uber Freight. What do you think has stuck with you the most from those two experiences? What do you think has kind of informed the way you've built your company? Like, I guess from like the company, from an entrepreneurial perspective, not necessarily the product.
Well, I think my experience at Coyote is actually part of why I wanted to become an entrepreneur. Watching Jeff build Coyote and being there from very early on, and just truly how we all were on this mission and excited about building something and making a difference in the market at the time, was just something that I was like, I would love to contribute to this in a way, and build something. So that has had a lasting effect on me. That experience at Coyote was great. I think Uber's experience is really watching like innovation at its core, whether it was Uber Freight or Uber as a company, and applying that concept and thinking about technology differently, being in San Francisco and like the core of that too, and the influence caused by that
The
was
mid
for me
2010s,
like,
right?
yeah,
Like, that was crazy. It must have been crazy. So
I think for me, that was the tipping point too, like surrounded by a ton of entrepreneurs doing all these different things, but also being with such a innovative company that had such an effect on rideshare, like specifically rideshare. And then we were looking at self-driving technology. That really was like, I want to be in the technology space more than I would want to be like managing transportation per se. So, and I learned a lot at Uber. And I think that's really like the scheduling piece for me. That's where the clarity came, and understanding not just the effect internally, but like how we could leverage a technology that's evolved over the years in making this a much better experience. So they both really had different influences on me, but led me to where I am today, for sure.
Very cool. What do you think? What do you think the freight brokerage industry is going to look like going forward? Like, is it going to fundamentally change from like sort of what? Because let me just preface it. The way I think about the impact that those quote unquote digital freight brokers have had is not that they necessarily like change the entire industry, but they made every single brokerage think about how they interact with both the carrier side, the capacity side, and the demand side, and what can actually happen digitally or through a website versus, right? I mean, is that like a decent way to think about like how the industry is moving forward?
I think, I mean, they had an influence for sure, and making companies more tech enabled, creating these marketplaces so that you can enhance your solution I think the industry and brokerages aren't going anywhere. Again, like I said, like every day is different. Every shipment has its issues. Like there's things that are technology is not going to solve for it.
Things always break.
Yeah. But I do think, and I'm starting to see the evolution is that companies are moving more to like exception management, right? Managing by exception rather than managing by tasks and exceptions.
Yep.
And that I think is where we'll see, how tech enables that and where the focus is really customer service. How are you managing the exceptions when they happen? And that's where you build those relationships.
And not touch the things that are going well and not even worry about touching the things.
If they're going great, don't touch them. They should be fine, right? But there are so many exceptions in our space that you can't eliminate that. And plus the aggregation of like asset to shipper, they're not going to want to take that on. So there's always going to be that intermediary. I just think that the way they approach managing that freight will be different.
Very interesting. I can honestly say I was just gonna say I can honestly say I have no idea. Like I'm definitely not enough of an expert in the inner workings of brokerage to like understand what is fundamentally going to change over the next 5 years. I observe, I talk to people who are way smarter on this than I am and try to absorb as much of that as possible. But and also I just don't get into the prediction game all that much because it's like I'm just setting myself up for failure that way. But I guess the thing I focus on the most is like what on the sales side is going to change. Because I think to a certain extent, like how you like interact with customers once you have them.
Yeah.
And how you sort of interface with the capacity side of things, that's going to become more and more homogenized over time. But like, how is it going to impact that like vision that everyone has of like endless rows of desks of college kids just pounding the college, right? Like
I always use that image, by the way, of talking about like, this is how things are still managed today.
Yeah. Right. Like, so is that going to change? And I don't have a good feel. Like it may just be that like, that is the best or the best, the worst, best, whatever. I'm messing that up. But like the way, what do they say about democracy? It's like it's a bad system, but it's the best one we have or something like maybe that's just the best way to reach the capacity side of the market and reach shippers. So I don't know. I just
don't know. It's very debatable. And we talk about like AI, and I saw there was like so much back and forth. CH had announced that they were using AI to respond back with quotes, and it was like outrage, right? You lose that customer relationship. There's no back and forth. You're not, getting your touch points. And I think there's a balance, right? There is something to be said about relationships and why I would give you my freight versus somebody else. And I don't think the human element ever leaves that experience. Like there still has to be that piece to it. I just think that's what will make you successful in having a brokerage or carrier capacity, et cetera, is that those touch points and that connectivity. It's just a matter of like what tasks make sense to automate and what tasks, require that person, and where do you lose touch at some point,
We could have a whole conversation just about that topic. 30 minutes. Okay. Last question. I ask this of every guest. Who's your favorite band or musician? And you have to tell me why.
So this was tough because I like a lot of different music, but I just went with an oldie and a goodie. I like Led Zeppelin. I enjoy them. I, love hearing different iterations of their songs, concerts, etc. I can get lost in it,
Their box set is like, you forget how many like good songs that aren't even on the radio all that much, but that anyway. Yeah, I think we've only ever had one other guest, if my memory is serving me, that said Led Zeppelin. But I would it would be really hard if someone asked me this question. It would be very hard to say someone other than them. I maybe have one or two others, but yeah, that's a good choice. You can never go wrong with that. Like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, like I'm not going to quibble with anyone, right? So
I prefer Led Zeppelin over Beatles, but that's just
yeah. I would say most days I do too. Deema, how can people reach you? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
They can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or they can reach out to me via email. It's deema@biggerpicture.co. And always happy to chat with anyone who's interested in talking freight.
Cool. Well, definitely encourage everyone who's listening in to reach out if it's relevant. Obviously, if not, if you just want to have a chat, I'm sure Deema would be open to that too. Thank you, Deema. This has been an awesome conversation.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, cool. Very cool. See you soon. All right. So we're almost already out of time, but there is still time for dad joke. I think on the last episode I said I had a pretty good dad joke waiting for you this episode. All right, so here goes. Where do bad rainbows go? To Prism, but it's a light sentence, so there's just enough time for some reflection. That's like a 2-3 layered dad joke. And actually, as I was thinking about it, it should be refraction, not reflection. But a person can't go through refraction. That would be very painful. In any case, thank you everyone who tuned in today. By the way, thank you Pamela, Matt, Fran, Constantino, Stephen for tuning in and your great comments. Really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much to Deema for an awesome conversation. Super glad I was able to have her on the show today. Thanks to Nicole, the world's best producer. Thanks to Sarah and the Let's Talk Supply Chain team. But most of all, thank you to all of you. Register for Inland 24. I want to see you all in Chicago. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.